As soon as her feet hit the ground, she was off running. She ran as hard and as fast as she could, and she did not look back, not even once. Not even when the sound of gunshots rang out behind her. Not even when her lungs started to burn. She just kept on going. She ran through the open field as her blood ran down her naked skin, slowly drying in place. The dark evening helped the rough ground and the branches of the trees claw at her skin, since these obstacles were now hard to see. But that didn't stop her either. She was not going to stop running, because she knew that there was no way she was going to allow herself to die back there. 20-year-old Amanda Burney and 19-year-old Ethan Walton rolled up in their car and came to a stop at 39-year-old Glen Gouker's rundown house in Prague, Oklahoma. It was an early morning on September 8th of 2010. Not too early, but early enough to get things moving for the day. Ethan had some land for sale that his father had given him, and Glen was interested in buying it. And so that morning, Ethan and Glen were going to finalize the $30,000 deal. After parking the car, Ethan looked over at Amanda, who was sitting in the passenger seat, and told her that this probably wouldn't take very long and that he would be back soon. Amanda had no interest in watching this transaction take place, so she looked at Ethan and said, "Okay, no problem. Take your time." Then made herself a bit more comfortable in her seat. She had a rough night the night before and was planning on catching a quick nap in the car while Ethan was in Glen's office. Glen's office was actually just a shed on his property that sat a little ways away from his main house. And so Ethan hopped out of the car, closed the door, and walked over to the office, where he swung the door open and went inside. Amanda woke up to a tapping sound coming from her window. As she opened her eyes, trying to adjust her vision to the bright sun outside the car, she could see the silhouette of someone standing at her car window. And as her eyes adjusted to the light, the image of a disheveled-looking Glen Gouker standing at the car door tapping on her window came into focus. Amanda opened the door trying to find out what he wanted, and Glen proceeded to ask her to join him and Ethan in his office so that she could witness some paperwork. Amanda resigned herself to the fact that nap time was over, so she stepped out of the car and walked over to the office with Glen, where he held the door open for her so that she could enter, and then he followed close behind. It took a moment for Amanda's eyes to adjust to the darkness inside of the makeshift office, since the light was very low and it had been so bright outside. But once her eyes had adjusted to the room, they came to rest on Ethan. And to Amanda's absolute horror, she found Ethan lying unconscious on the floor of the office, and it was at this point when Amanda heard the bolt on the door behind her slide shut. Turning around quickly to see what was going on, she found herself face to face with Glen, who was now holding a gun and pointing it at her. As he walked towards her, he pushed her back further and further into the shed until she was backed right up against a freezer. And that is when he pulled out a knife and started to cut her clothes from her body. By some miracle, Glen utterly failed to violate Amanda. Even though he had tried as hard as he could, he was forced to give up. After his total failure, he taped her mouth shut, then covered her head with a sack, and then handcuffed her to a pole so that she couldn't escape. When he was done securing her and he was sure that she would not get away, he left her there with Ethan, who was still laying on the floor making small whimpering sounds that were mixed with snoring. She couldn't see him, but Amanda could hear Ethan breathing. And as she listened, she could hear that his breathing was becoming more and more shallow as the hours ticked by. And then, after about 5 or 6 hours of them both being trapped inside the shed, Ethan suddenly went silent. Even though Amanda could not see him, she knew deep down inside that he had passed away in that very moment. As she was sitting on the floor in the silence thinking about what had just happened, she was jolted out of her thoughts by the sound of the bolt on the door unlocking again. The door swung open, and that is when Glen walked inside, untied Amanda, removed the sack from her head, and guided her out of the shed, taking her into the house. Standing in the bedroom, Amanda's mind was racing. She could see that the 4-poster bed in front of her had rope tied to each corner. Glen looked over at Amanda before he grabbed her and callously threw her down onto the bed, where he proceeded to tie her wrists and her ankles with the rope that Amanda had been looking at. While he was doing this, Amanda tried her best to look around and assess her situation, and in doing so, her first instinct was to look at the door. And when she did, to her absolute shock, her eyes came to rest on two little girls who were maybe 4 years old. These two little girls were peeking into the room looking at her. Amanda couldn't believe it. Then, all of a sudden, Glen spotted them too. He started shouting at them, yelling at them to get out of here as he got up from tying Amanda down so that he could slam the door shut. And then right after the door was shut, Amanda could hear a woman's voice yelling out to Glen, saying that he should have made sure the door was closed in the first place. Once Amanda was tied up and Glen was confident she could not escape, he put a blindfold over her eyes and then he bent down close to her ear and whispered his intention to her. Glen proceeded to tell her, in the most sinister way he could, that he was going to sell her as a sex slave. Her life was going to consist of being used by paying customers until the time came when she wasn't bringing in money anymore. Chuckling to himself, he stood up and then turned and left the room, locking it behind him. Amanda lay there in the darkness, pulling on her arms and moving her legs to calculate the extent of how thoroughly she had been restrained. Then she heard the door unlock and open. It was Glen, checking on her. He poked his head in, looked around, and then closed and locked the door again. The appearance of Glen put Amanda on edge, but when he left without doing anything, she was able to relax again. Approximately an hour went by, and the door opened again, with Glen checking on her. And then again, he closed and locked the door. Amanda quickly learned that this was Glen's schedule. Every hour, he checked on her. Amanda had laid there long enough to know that she was not willing to die the way Glen had planned. She was not willing to become a sex slave. And so as she lay there, she began working on her wrist restraints. Every time she heard the door unlock, she would stop what she was doing and just lay there until she heard the door lock again. Then she would set to work untying herself again, and eventually her efforts paid off. Finally, after hours of struggling with the rope, Amanda had freed her wrists, and right away, she pulled off her blindfold. Looking around the room, Amanda could not believe what she was seeing. Inside the room with her were dozens of different guns and knives hanging on the bedroom wall. She couldn't believe her luck. As she stared at the weapons around her, she was snapped back to reality when she heard it again. The door was being unlocked. Quickly, she put her blindfold back on, laid down, and placed the ropes around her wrists to appear like she was still tied down. The door opened, and then again, closed and locked. Shortly after this check-in, Amanda heard Glen shout to someone that he was leaving and would be back later on. Amanda removed her blindfold again and began working on her ankle restraints when suddenly the door was being unlocked. It hadn't been an hour since the last check-in, and Glen was gone. So Amanda had no idea what was going on. Quickly, she laid down, put everything back into place, hoping not to be caught, and this is when Michelle Gouker poked her head into the room to check on Amanda. Then, when she was satisfied that nothing was going on, she closed the door and locked it. Amanda quickly came to learn that Michelle did not work on the same schedule as Glen. Instead, she checked on Amanda every half hour. Amanda had to work quickly. She didn't want to miss the chance of escape while Glen was away, so as soon as the door closed, Amanda untied the ankle restraints, got off the bed, and began to check every single gun in the room for ammunition. One after another, she came up empty-handed, and once the final gun was checked and no ammunition was found, Amanda took hold of 2 large hunting knives and waited for the door to open again. Amanda stood there waiting, anticipating how she was going to attack this strange woman on the other side of the door. Then she heard the lock one more time. She watched the doorknob turn, and as the door began to open, Amanda wasted no time. When Michelle looked into the room, Amanda rushed the door, slashing with the knives, trying as hard as she could to get the door wide enough to make her way through. But Michelle had the upper hand, and before Amanda could get out, Michelle slammed the door shut and locked it. Now they knew that Amanda wasn't restrained anymore, and Amanda was desperate. She didn't care what happened now. All she knew was that she wasn't going to be tied up again. She looked around the room, and without a second thought, Amanda smashed the window and climbed through it, jumping down to the ground, totally naked and bleeding. She could hear Michelle screaming out for Glen, yelling at him that Amanda had escaped, and hearing this, Amanda bolted. She ran as hard and as fast as she could, and she did not look back, not even once, not even when the sound of gunshots rang out, echoing through the air, not even when her lungs started to burn. She just kept on going. She ran through the open field as the blood ran down her naked skin. The dark evening helped the rough ground and the branches of the trees claw at her skin, since they were hard to see at that point. But that didn't stop her either. She was not going to stop running, because she knew that there was no way she was going to allow herself to die back there. Finally, after running for what seemed like forever, off in the distance she could see a house with its lights on. This house was her best shot at survival, and so that's where she went. When she got there, she ran up the front steps up to the door, and without knocking, she turned the doorknob, finding the door unlocked. Without any hesitation, Amanda just ran straight into the house, slamming and locking the door behind her. Once inside, Amanda and the woman who lived there found themselves face to face. The occupant of the house just looked at Amanda standing there naked, covered in dirt and blood, and holding a large knife. She was stunned. Amanda quickly explained to the lady what had just happened and why she was now standing in this woman's living room like this. After hearing Amanda's story, the lady walked over to her phone to call the police. And once they were on the phone, Amanda quickly grabbed the phone out of this woman's hand to speak to the police herself. Amanda wanted to be sure that this woman was just somebody living in this house and not somebody who was associated with the Goukers. When Amanda was satisfied that the police were actually on the phone and that they were now on their way to see her, Amanda started to relax a little bit. But that didn't last long, because once Amanda hung up the phone, there was a knock on the door. Looking at one another, the woman quickly hid Amanda in the closet because it was totally abnormal for there to be visitors at that time of night. And so the homeowner was suspicious of who might be at the front door. Once Amanda was hidden, the lady answered the door, and standing there was Glen Gouker. He asked her if she had seen anything strange that night, and the lady told him she hadn't. Nothing any different than any other night, and so Glen, satisfied with her response, turned and left. Amanda waited at the lady's house until the police arrived, where she proceeded to tell them her entire story. Shortly after learning the terrible events that she had just gone through, the police descended upon the Goukers' property, where they found Ethan's body, which had been bound with zip ties and stuffed into a 55-gallon drum located inside the shed. It was later determined that his cause of death was a combination of blunt force trauma to the head, as well as internal bleeding. Amanda was taken to the hospital, where DNA samples were recovered from her body, and these samples matched with another murder case that had been unsolved for quite some time. Glen was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and indecent assault, for which he received 4 life sentences plus 10 years. Glen would never be a free man again. Michelle, who was living with Glen as his wife, also turned out to be his stepsister, and the 2 little girls that Amanda had seen were their 4-year-old twin daughters together. Michelle was charged with kidnapping and received a 20-year sentence. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed today's story, please be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads, and I will see you again later.